Gene was a lonely child. There weren't many kids his age around Key West at the time. Sometimes he played with the servants' children, but his mother Minnie would scold him. The Ottos were of a certain wealth and stature. They shouldn't be seen cavorting with a bohemian child. What would the neighbors think, after all? On his 4th birthday, his grandfather gave him a doll. He'd just returned from his travels in Europe, and he'd found the doll in Germany. It came from a famous toy company, the Steiff Company. But this doll was special. It was one of a kind. His grandfather explained that he saw it in the window of the toy shop, and he knew he had to have it. It was about 4 feet tall, just shorter than Gene himself, and it carried with it a little stuffed dog. Gene cared little about its origins. All he knew was he finally had a friend. He named it Robert, after himself. Gene's full name was Robert Eugene Otto, but people called him Gene. And from that day forward, he took Robert with him everywhere. Welcome to History, Mystery, and the Unexplained, the show where we look at everything from true crime to cryptids, the paranormal, and beyond. Today we're exploring the tale of Robert the Doll. But before we get started, please like, subscribe, follow, or whatever on the platform of your choice, and be sure to give us a review. I'd love to hear what you think. Minnie dressed her son's new doll in one of Gene's old outfits. It was a little sailor suit he'd grown out of. She'd always loved that outfit, and it would be a shame to get rid of it. It was still in good condition after all. And Gene said Robert liked the outfit too. Robert really did become Gene's best friend. He played with him constantly, had a place for him at the table. He even insisted that Robert get a plate. To him, Robert was like a real boy. In the beginning, his parents thought it was cute. Lots of children have imaginary friends, after all, and Robert was no different. They thought. A focal point for a child's imagination. Sometimes it got a little annoying, a little frustrating. Like when Gene would insist that Robert join them at the beach. Or when Gene would spend all day in his room playing with Robert in lieu of doing his schoolwork. Minnie could hear him through the door, whispering to the doll. And sometimes she heard someone answer back. It was a low, guttural voice. Not the voice of a child. Not even the voice of a man. She could never make out the words, but every time she looked in on him, Gene was sitting alone, cross-legged on the floor with Robert across from him. If Gene's back was to the door and Robert was opposite, she could swear he was staring at her. As the years went on, Robert started making her feel uneasy. She couldn't quite place it exactly. When she reprimanded her son, she could swear Robert's face changed. But that's not possible, right? He's a doll. He's nothing but cloth and straw. Things continued this way for years, An occasional giggle heard somewhere in the house. That low voice and the pitter-patter of tiny feet. All things that can somehow otherwise be explained. The wind settling floors. Sounds traveling from the other side of the house. The servants, their kids, their friends. When Jean was 10, Minnie kissed her son goodnight and tucked him in. And Robert. Don't forget Robert, Mama. She kissed the doll's soft cloth head. The taste of dust lingered on her lips as she joined her husband in bed. So far, this was just a usual day. Minnie and her husband Thomas were suddenly awoken by screaming. Loud banging and breaking glass. They rushed to their son's room only to find the door locked. They could hear Jean crying, "Help me, Mama! Help me!" He pleaded. Thomas slammed his shoulder against the door, busting the latch. Jean was against the floor, hugging his knees to his chest. The room was in disarray. The dresser was turned on its side, a chair upside down, toys scattered around the room, some torn apart. Robert sat on the edge of the bed as if surveying everything. Minnie wrapped her arms around Jean, but Thomas was furious. He was woken up. The room was destroyed, and his son was alone. You want to tell me what the hell happened here? All Jean could say was Robert did it. This became a mantra they heard repeatedly. A broken vase, Robert did it. A crushed toy, Robert. Their young, charismatic kid suddenly became meek and withdrawn. Thomas and Minnie had had enough. They locked Robert away in the attic. If only that were the end of this story. These noises, they once explained away as the wind or the creaking floors persisted, even increased. It got to the point that they couldn't keep servants on staff. Time and time again, employees would quit, complaining about the footsteps in the attic and the general feel of unease. Little white streaks caught from the corner of the eye, followed by a giggle. Neighbors would comment about seeing a child in the upstairs window, even after all the children had moved away. Gene grew up. He studied art in Chicago and New York and eventually even in France. He met and married Annette Parker. After the passing of his parents, he inherited and moved into his childhood home in Florida. One of the first things he did was go up in the attic and retrieve his childhood toy. He set it up in a special place in his art studio, where Robert could look out the window. It was the same room he had shared with him as a child. It said that the children in the area would avoid the home. Robert's eyes would follow them. Sometimes Robert would simply disappear from the window. A brief look away and he'd be back. Much like his mother, in time Anne became uneasy with Robert. She pleaded with her husband to put the doll back in the attic. Reluctantly, he complied. Those footsteps from his youth returned, along with the giggles. This was as if the doll was running around the attic. They'd say Robert would mock them from the attic window. Gene hadn't put the doll anywhere near the window. But when he went into the attic, he found it sitting there in a rocking chair, staring down at the world below. Gene would move him away from the window, but time and time again, he'd find him once again in the rocking chair. In 1974, Robert Eugene Otto passed away, and Anne moved elsewhere. The home was purchased by Myrtle Router. While exploring the attic, Myrtle found Robert, the doll, stashed away in a trunk. She gave it to her 10-year-old daughter, who absolutely loved the 70-plus-year-old toy. That was until one night when she was woken from her sleep, finding Robert had moved across the room on its own. She had left him on the dresser with all of her other dolls, but she woke up to find him sitting on the bed beside her. For reasons unknown, Myrtle kept Robert for 20 years. Obviously not in her daughter's room, but nonetheless in the house. In 1994, Robert was donated to the East Martello Museum. In the beginning, the museum didn't know what to do with it. It was an old doll. They just simply kept it in the back. But reputation had already spread of the doll's cursed behavior. People kept coming into the museum just to see Robert. Many times the museum curator would take the morbidly curious to the back room to see him. Eventually, they moved him to a glass case for all. But with it came a warning not to photograph Robert, and certainly never to mock him. If you must snap that selfie, you must ask permission. Letters pour in daily from people who didn't heed this warning. Even former President Bush wrote Robert asking for a term without shenanigans. And of course, people at the museum have heard laughter and footsteps, and have found Robert in various positions, despite being in a sealed glass case. If you want to see him for yourself, he is still at the museum. And as for the house he once called home for 90 years, it's now a B&B. You can even sleep in Gene's old room. That's it for today, folks. Till next time, I'm Christopher Grenowitz, and thanks for listening.